The woman kneeling before the altar turned when she heard my footsteps, and her eyes held a knowledge that made my blood freeze. She knew something about my mother that could destroy everything I believed about my family. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across her face as she rose gracefully, her dark blue gown rustling against the cold stone floor of the chapel. I had come here seeking solitude before tonight's grand ball, but destiny had other plans. My name is Lysander Ashworth, Duke of Westmont, and at 28 years old, I commanded one of the most respected estates in all of England. The weight of my title had settled upon my shoulders just 2 years prior when my father passed, leaving me to uphold a legacy that stretched back 7 generations. Tonight's ball was meant to celebrate my recent return from diplomatic duties in France, but all I craved was a moment of peace in this sacred place where my mother used to pray. She had been gone for 15 years now, taken by consumption when I was barely 13. Her memory was the cornerstone of everything I held dear about our family's honor. Lady Margaret Ashworth had been renowned throughout the kingdom for her charitable works and unwavering moral compass. Even now, portraits of her gentle smile adorned the walls of Westmont Manor, and her favorite white roses bloomed year-round in the conservatory I had built in her memory. But this woman, this stranger who couldn't be more than 24 years of age, was looking at me with eyes that seemed to pierce through decades of carefully preserved family history. Her auburn hair was pulled back in an elegant arrangement, with small pearls catching the candlelight. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was her expression that unnerved me. There was sympathy there, mixed with something that looked dangerously close to pity. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried the refined accent of nobility, though I didn't recognize her from any of the great houses. She curtsied with perfect form, but her eyes never left mine. "I apologize for intruding upon your solitude. I was simply paying my respects." I stepped closer, my polished boots echoing against the ancient stones. The chapel was small and intimate, built by my great-grandfather as a private place of worship for our family. Stained glass windows depicted scenes of redemption and forgiveness, their colors muted in the evening light. The air carried the familiar scent of beeswax and old wood, mixed with something else, something floral that seemed to emanate from this mysterious woman. "You know me, yet I confess I don't know you," I said, studying her face for any clue to her identity. "Are you a guest for tonight's festivities? I thought I knew all the families who would be attending." She smiled then, but it was a sad smile that sent an unexpected chill through me. "I am Cordelia Harrington of the Sussex Harringtons. My family, we knew your mother quite well, Your Grace." Very well indeed. The way she spoke those last words made my heart skip. There was weight behind them, a significance that I couldn't grasp but felt in my bones. My mother had been friends with many noble families, of course, but something in Miss Harrington's tone suggested a connection far deeper than mere social acquaintance. "My mother," I said carefully, "was beloved by all who knew her. She was a woman of exceptional virtue and kindness. I'm certain she would have remembered the Harrington family fondly." Cordelia's green eyes flickered with something that looked almost like pain. She glanced toward the altar where a simple wooden cross stood, illuminated by dozens of votive candles that I had lit in my mother's memory. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of unspoken words. "Your Grace," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "there are some things that even the most virtuous hearts must keep hidden, some secrets that are carried not out of shame, but out of love." My throat tightened. "What are you suggesting about my mother?" She took a step closer, and I caught the full impact of her presence. She was intelligent. I could see that immediately with the kind of sharp awareness that came from careful education and natural wit. But there was also something vulnerable about her, as if she carried burdens that had aged her beyond her years. "I'm suggesting nothing, Your Grace. I'm simply here to listen, should you ever wish to know the complete truth about Lady Margaret's life." The way she said complete truth made my hands clench in a fist at my sides. What was incomplete about what I already knew? My mother had been the perfect duchess, devoted to my father, dedicated to charity, beloved by the entire county. She had died peacefully, surrounded by family, after a life lived in service to others. "Miss Harrington," I said, my voice carrying the authority I had learned to wield as Duke. "If you have something to say about my mother's memory, I suggest you speak plainly." But she shook her head, that same sad smile playing about her lips. "This is neither the time nor the place for such conversations, Your Grace. Tonight is meant for celebration, for joy. I wouldn't dream of casting shadows over such festivities." I stepped even closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, close enough to detect the subtle scent of lavender in her hair. "You've already cast shadows, Miss Harrington. You cannot speak in riddles about my mother and then simply walk away." "I can, and I must," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "At least for now." Outside the chapel, I could hear the sounds of preparation beginning at the manor. Carriages were arriving, servants were bustling about, and the evening's grand celebration was taking shape. But in this small, sacred space, the world had narrowed to just the two of us and the terrible weight of whatever secret she carried. "When then?" I asked, surprised by the urgency in my own voice. "When will you tell me what you think you know?" She studied my face for a long moment, as if trying to memorize every detail. Then she reached into her small silk purse and withdrew a folded piece of paper. The parchment looked old, yellowed with age, and tied with a faded blue ribbon. "If you truly wish to know," she said, holding out the letter, "read this after the ball. But Your Grace, I warn you, some truths change everything. Once you know, you can never unknow." My hand trembled slightly as I took the letter from her. The paper felt fragile, as if it might crumble at any moment. The blue ribbon was silk, expensive, the kind my mother had favored for her correspondence. I could even catch a faint trace of her signature perfume clinging to the fibers after all these years. The sound of footsteps echoed from the chapel entrance, and we both turned to see my valet, Morrison, approaching with obvious relief on his weathered face. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but you're needed at the manor. The first guests have arrived, and Lord Pemberton is asking for you specifically." I looked back at Cordelia, but she was already moving toward a side exit, her gown rustling softly against the stone floor. At the doorway, she turned back one final time. "Enjoy your evening, Your Grace," she said. "Dance, laugh, celebrate. There will be time enough for difficult truths tomorrow." And then she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the chapel with a mysterious letter and more questions than I had ever imagined possible. The candlelight flickered around me, casting the same dancing shadows, but everything felt different now. The foundations of everything I believed about my family had been shaken by a woman I had never met, carrying secrets about a mother I thought I had known completely. I slipped the letter inside my waistcoat, close to my heart, and followed Morrison back toward the manor. Tonight, I would play the role of the gracious host, the noble Duke celebrating with his peers. But tomorrow I would discover what Cordelia Harrington knew about my mother that could change everything. The grand ballroom of Westmont Manor had been transformed into a glittering paradise. Crystal chandeliers cast warm golden light across walls adorned with silk tapestries, while hundreds of beeswax candles filled the air with their sweet fragrance. The polished marble floor reflected the elegant movements of nearly 200 guests, all dressed in their finest evening attire. Powdered wigs caught the light as ladies curtsied in their elaborate gowns of silk and velvet, their stays pulled tight to create the fashionable silhouette of the season. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, accepting congratulations on my recent diplomatic success, sharing pleasantries about the weather and the harvest, discussing matters of trade and politics with fellow peers. But my mind remained fixed on the letter pressed against my chest and the woman who had delivered it. Every time I caught a glimpse of auburn hair or heard a refined feminine laugh, my heart would quicken, hoping to spot Cordelia among the guests. Lord Pemberton approached me near the refreshment table, where servants in pristine livery served champagne from crystal flutes and delicate pastries arranged on silver platters. He was my father's oldest friend and had served as my unofficial advisor since I inherited the title. His gray wig was perfectly styled, and his burgundy velvet coat displayed the finest embroidery that London's tailors could provide. "Lysander, my boy," he said, raising his glass in a toast. A magnificent evening indeed. Your mother would have been so proud to see Westmont Manor hosting such elegant company once again. The mention of my mother sent a sharp pang through my chest. Thank you, Lord Pemberton. She did always love these gatherings, bringing people together in celebration. He nodded, his weathered face creasing into a fond smile. Lady Margaret had a gift for making everyone feel welcome, regardless of their station. She was quite remarkable in that way. I remember one particular evening when she insisted on inviting the local vicar's daughter to dance alongside the Duchess of York. Caused quite the stir, but your mother wouldn't hear a word of criticism. I found myself studying his expression carefully, searching for any hint of secrets or hidden knowledge. Tell me more about those days, Lord Pemberton. I was so young when she passed. Sometimes I feel as though I barely knew her as anything more than my devoted mother. His eyes took on a distant quality as he gazed across the ballroom. Your mother was complex, Lysander. She had depths that even your father didn't fully understand, I suspect. She was passionate about justice, about helping those who couldn't help themselves. Sometimes that passion led her into situations that others might have found unconventional. Before I could press him for more details, the music began for the evening's first formal dance. A minuet, traditional and elegant, requiring precise steps and graceful coordination between partners. I had been expected to open the dancing with Lady Catherine Pemberton, Lord Pemberton's eldest daughter, and a woman many considered a suitable match for my station. Lady Catherine was lovely, with pale blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls and a gown of rose-colored silk that complemented her fair complexion perfectly. She was accomplished in all the arts expected of a nobleman's daughter: painting, music, languages, and conversation. We had danced together many times before, and she moved with the confident grace of someone born to high society. But as we began the intricate steps of the minuet, my eyes continued to scan the crowd. Where was Cordelia Harrington? Had she left the estate entirely, or was she somewhere among the guests? Watching me navigate this world of artificial pleasantries while carrying the weight of whatever truth she possessed? Your Grace seems distracted this evening, Lady Catherine observed as we completed a turn. Her voice held just a hint of reproach, though her smile remained perfectly polite. Forgive me, Lady Catherine. I fear the responsibilities of hosting have scattered my attention somewhat. She tilted her head slightly, studying my face with intelligent blue eyes. It's quite understandable, though I must say, I noticed you speaking with a young woman in the chapel earlier. I don't believe I recognized her. A new addition to local society. My steps faltered almost imperceptibly. You saw us in the chapel? I was walking in the gardens and happened to glance through the window. She was quite striking with that auburn hair. I don't believe I've seen her at any of the county gatherings this season. The music continued around us, violins and harpsichord creating an elegant backdrop to conversations and laughter throughout the ballroom. But I found myself focusing intensely on Lady Catherine's words, grateful for any information about the mysterious Miss Harrington. Miss Cordelia Harrington, I said carefully, of the Sussex Harringtons. She mentioned knowing my mother. Lady Catherine's expression shifted subtly, though she maintained her composure. Harrington? Yes, I believe I recall that name from years past. There was some connection to your family, though I can't quite remember the details. My father might know more about the Sussex branch of that family. The dance concluded, and I escorted Lady Catherine back to where her parents waited. But her casual mention of a family connection from years past only added to the growing weight of questions in my mind. How many people knew something about my mother's past that I didn't? How many secrets had been kept from me in the name of protecting my memory of her? As the evening progressed, I found myself paying closer attention to conversations around me, listening for any mention of my mother or the Harrington family. I danced with several other young ladies, discussed agricultural improvements with neighboring landowners, and listened to tales of London society from recent visitors to the capital. But underneath it all, I felt like an actor playing a role, going through the motions while my real attention remained focused on the letter hidden against my heart. During a break in the dancing, I stepped out onto the terrace for fresh air. The November night was crisp and clear, with stars visible through the bare branches of the ancient oak trees that surrounded the manor. The sounds of music and laughter drifted out through the open French doors, creating a pleasant contrast to the peaceful silence of the countryside. I was surprised to find Mrs. Whitmore, our head housekeeper, directing servants as they prepared additional refreshments on a side table. She had served our family for over 30 years and had been particularly devoted to my mother. Her gray hair was neatly arranged under a white cap, and her black dress was perfectly pressed despite the long day of preparation. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said, approaching her quietly, "everything looks magnificent tonight." Mother would have been pleased. Her lined face softened with genuine affection. "Thank you, Your Grace." Lady Margaret did love a good celebration, that's certain. She had such joy in bringing people together. I hesitated, then decided to take advantage of the private moment. "Mrs. Whitmore, you knew my mother better than most. Were there aspects of her life that might have been kept private? Things that perhaps a young boy wouldn't have been told?" She glanced around nervously, ensuring that no servants were within earshot. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your Grace, there are always things in a person's life that remain private. Your mother was a good woman, a loving mother, and a devoted wife. That's what matters. But there were other things?" Mrs. Whitmore's hands twisted nervously in her white apron. "Your mother, she had a large heart, Your Grace. Sometimes that led her to situations that required discretion. But everything she did out of love." Before I could ask more questions, she hurried back inside, leaving me alone on the terrace with even more uncertainty than before. Everyone seemed to know something that I didn't, speaking in careful phrases and meaningful glances that only served to deepen the mystery. I pulled the letter from my waistcoat and held it up to the moonlight streaming down from above. The blue ribbon gleamed softly, and I could just make out the elegant handwriting on the exterior. My mother's name was written there in a flowing script, though I couldn't determine if it was her handwriting or someone else's. The temptation to break the seal and read the contents immediately was almost overwhelming. But something held me back, some instinct that once I opened this letter, there would be no returning to the comfortable certainty I'd always felt about my family's history. Cordelia's warning echoed in my mind. Some truths change everything. I slipped the letter back inside my coat and returned to the ballroom, where the dancing had resumed with even greater energy. The evening was reaching its peak, with guests laughing and celebrating with the kind of abandon that only came after sufficient champagne and excellent company. But I felt more isolated than ever, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet carrying a secret that seemed to separate me from everything I believed about my own life. As midnight approached and the last dance of the evening was announced, I found myself scanning the crowd one final time for any sign of Cordelia Harrington. But she had vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared, leaving behind only questions and a letter that promised to change everything I thought I knew about the woman who had given me life. The last guest departed Westmont Manor just after 2 in the morning, their carriage wheels crunching across the gravel drive as they disappeared into the darkness. I stood in the grand foyer, still wearing my formal evening attire, watching Morrison and the other servants begin the process of restoring order to the ballroom. Crystal glasses clinked softly as they were cleared from tables, and the sweet fragrance of dying flowers mingled with the lingering scent of beeswax candles. But I could wait no longer. The letter seemed to burn against my chest, demanding attention with every breath I took. I dismissed the remaining servants, telling them to finish their duties in the morning, and made my way to my private study. The room had been my father's sanctuary and was now mine, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive mahogany desk that had been carved by Italian craftsmen 2 centuries earlier. I lit several candles and settled into the burgundy leather chair behind the desk, my hands trembling slightly as I withdrew the mysterious letter from my waistcoat. The blue ribbon felt smooth between my fingers as I untied it carefully, almost reverently. The paper was indeed old, far older than I had initially realized. As I unfolded it, I caught that faint trace of my mother's perfume again, as if her memory had been preserved within the very fibers. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's, elegant and flowing, with the characteristic flourishes she used when writing formal correspondence. But this letter was different from any I had ever seen her write. The words seemed hurried, emotional, written with an urgency that was completely unlike her usual composed manner. "My dearest friend," the letter began, and my heart clenched as I read those words in my mother's familiar script. "I can no longer bear this burden alone. The choice I made 15 years ago haunts me every moment, and I fear that my silence has caused more pain than my honesty ever could. You have been so patient, so understanding, but I know that your heart breaks each day as surely as mine does." I paused, reading the opening lines again. 15 years ago would have been right around the time of my birth. What choice could my mother have made then that would cause such anguish? And who was this dear friend who apparently shared in some terrible secret? The letter continued. "Thomas believes he is protecting me by insisting we maintain the deception, but I see how it destroys you to remain silent. You have sacrificed everything for my reputation, for my family's honor, and I cannot allow it to continue. The truth must be told, if not to the world, then at least to those who have the right to know. My son will one day need to understand the circumstances of his birth, and when that time comes, I pray he will find forgiveness in his heart for the choices we made." My hands were shaking so violently now that the candlelight made the words dance before my eyes. The circumstances of my birth? What could my mother possibly mean? I had been born in wedlock to the Duke and Duchess of Westmont, delivered by the finest physicians in London. There had never been any question about my legitimacy or my place in the family line. But as I read on, my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my origins began to crumble like ancient parchment exposed to flame. You asked me once if I regretted the decision we made, if I wished we had chosen differently despite the scandal it would have caused. I told you then that I had no regrets, that my marriage to Thomas had given me security and position, that it was better for everyone involved. But I lied, my dear heart. I have regretted it every single day for 15 years. Not because I don't love the life I've built, not because I'm ungrateful for the privileges of my position, but because I forced you to give up the greatest joy of your life for the sake of my reputation. I stopped reading, my mind reeling as the implications of those words sank in. My mother had made some choice 15 years ago that had caused someone else to sacrifice the greatest joy of their life. And that choice was somehow connected to the circumstances of my birth. The room seemed to spin around me as I struggled to comprehend what I was reading. The letter continued with even more devastating revelations. Our son deserves to know that he was created from love, not duty. He deserves to know that his father is a man of honor and integrity, even if society would condemn the choices we made. When I watch Lysander grow into the remarkable young man he's becoming, I see so much of you in him. His sense of justice, his compassion for others, his unwillingness to accept injustice when he sees it. These are your qualities, not Thomas's, and sometimes I wonder if he suspects the truth. The words seemed to blur before my eyes as the full weight of the revelation crashed over me. Our son, his father, Thomas, the man I had called father my entire life, was not my biological parent. This mysterious friend to whom my mother was writing, this person who had apparently sacrificed everything for her reputation, was my true father. I set the letter down on the desk and buried my face in my hands, trying to process the enormity of what I had just learned. Everything I had believed about myself, about my family, about my place in the world, had been built on a foundation of carefully maintained lies. The Duke of Westmont, the man who had raised me, taught me about honor and duty, who had loved me as his own son, had known all along that I was not his blood heir. But who was my real father? The letter gave no name, no indication of his identity beyond the passionate love my mother clearly felt for him. I picked up the letter again, searching desperately for any clue that might reveal his identity. I know you worry that Thomas will discover our correspondence, but he has never questioned my friendships or my charitable activities. He trusts me completely, which only makes my deception more painful. Sometimes I think it would be easier if he suspected, if he confronted me and demanded the truth. This careful dance we all perform, pretending that nothing has changed, pretending that we don't all carry this secret, exhausts me beyond measure. The charitable activities. My mother had been renowned for her work with various causes, traveling frequently to London and other parts of the country to attend meetings and organize relief efforts. Had those trips been cover for meetings with my true father? Had her reputation for virtue and good works been an elaborate facade to hide an ongoing relationship? I thought of all the times she had returned from these journeys with a particular glow about her, a happiness that seemed to radiate from within. I had always attributed it to her satisfaction in helping others, but now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. The letter concluded with words that broke my heart even as they revealed the depth of my mother's internal struggle. I have made my choice to honor my marriage vows and remain Thomas's wife, but I cannot ask you to continue sacrificing your happiness for my decision. If you choose to reveal the truth, I will support you completely, regardless of the consequences to my reputation or position. Our son has a right to know his true father, and you have a right to claim the child you helped create. I love you both more than my own life, and I pray that someday we will all find peace with the choices we have made. The letter was signed simply, "Forever yours, Margaret." I sat in the flickering candlelight for what felt like hours, reading and rereading those devastating words. My mother had loved another man while married to the Duke of Westmont. She had borne that man's child, me, and had lived with the secret for my entire life. The man I called father had raised me knowing I was not his blood, had loved me and provided for me despite the deception. And somewhere out, there was my true father, a man who had apparently sacrificed his own happiness to protect my mother's reputation, who had watched from a distance as I grew up, never knowing who he really was. The implications for my title, my inheritance, my entire future were staggering. If the truth came out, it would cause the greatest scandal in the history of our family. The Duke of Westmont's heir was illegitimate, the product of an adulterous affair. Everything I had inherited, everything I had worked to build and preserve, could be stripped away in an instant. But beyond the practical concerns, I felt a profound sense of loss and confusion about my own identity. Who was I really? What parts of my personality came from this unknown father versus the man who had raised me? Why had my mother never found a way to tell me the truth before she died? As dawn began to filter through the heavy curtains of the study, I finally understood why Cordelia Harrington had looked at me with such sadness and sympathy. She knew. Somehow, she knew the truth about my parentage, and she had been waiting for the right moment to reveal it. But how did she know? What was her connection to this family secret that had been hidden for nearly 3 decades? I needed to find her. I needed answers to questions I hadn't even known to ask. And most importantly, I needed to discover the identity of the man who was my true father, the man my mother had loved enough to risk everything for, the man who had apparently loved her and me enough to sacrifice his own happiness for our well-being. The letter had changed everything, just as Cordelia had warned it would. But it had also opened a door to understanding parts of my mother's life that had always seemed mysterious, parts of my own nature that had never quite made sense. For the first time in my life, I was about to embark on a journey not to fulfill the expectations of my title, but to discover the truth about who I really was. I found Cordelia Harrington 3 days later in the village of Little Bramford, teaching reading to a group of children in the small schoolhouse behind the parish church. The November morning was gray and cold, with frost still clinging to the windows, but inside the modest room warmth radiated from both the coal fire and the genuine laughter of a dozen young voices reciting their letters. She looked up when I entered, and I saw no surprise in those intelligent green eyes. She had been expecting me, just as she had orchestrated our meeting in the chapel. She was dressed simply today in a wool dress of deep green that complemented her coloring, with her auburn hair arranged in a practical style that spoke of someone more concerned with purpose than fashion. "Children," she said gently, "please continue practicing your letters while I speak with our visitor. Sarah, would you help little Thomas with his alphabet?" The oldest girl, perhaps 10 years of age, nodded solemnly and moved to assist a younger boy who was struggling with his slate. I was struck by the obvious affection and respect these children showed toward Cordelia. This was not the idle charitable work that many society ladies performed for appearances. This was genuine dedication to improving these young lives. "Miss Harrington," I said when she approached, my voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil that had consumed me for 3 sleepless nights. "I believe we have much to discuss." "Indeed we do, Your Grace." She gestured toward a small alcove where adult-sized chairs had been arranged near a window. "I assume you found the letter illuminating?" I studied her face as we settled into the chairs, searching for any sign of her connection to the revelations that had shattered my understanding of myself. "You know what was in that letter before I opened it?" It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it as one. "Yes, I knew. My family has been connected to yours for longer than you realize, Your Grace, in ways that go far deeper than social acquaintance." "Then you know who he is," I said, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You know the identity of my true father." The children's voices provided a gentle backdrop to our conversation as they continued their lessons, their innocence a stark contrast to the heavy truths being revealed between us. Cordelia's hands folded carefully in her lap, and I noticed they were not the soft, pampered hands of a typical lady of leisure. They showed signs of real work, of genuine labor in service of others. "Your father," she said carefully, "is a man of exceptional character who has lived with the consequences of loving your mother for nearly 30 years. He has watched you from a distance, celebrated your achievements, worried about your struggles, and never once regretted the choice he made to step aside so that you could be raised with the security and privileges that the Westmont name provided." My heart pounded as I leaned forward in my chair. "But who is he? What is his name? Where can I find him?" Cordelia's eyes filled with a mixture of compassion and something that looked almost like pride. "Your father, Your Grace, is my father, Sir Edmund Harrington of Sussex. And I am your half-sister." The world seemed to stop around us. The children's voices faded into background noise as I stared at this woman who had just revealed herself to be my blood relative. The connection I had felt to her in the chapel, the immediate sense of understanding and familiarity, suddenly made perfect sense. "Your sister," I repeated, the words feeling strange on my tongue. "You're my sister." "Half-sister," she corrected gently. "My mother died when I was very young, and my father never remarried. He told me about your mother when I was old enough to understand, explained why he could never publicly acknowledge his love for her or claim you as a son. He made me promise to watch over you from a distance, to ensure that you were well and happy, even though we could never have a real relationship." I stood abruptly and moved to the window, looking out at the village street where people were going about their daily business, completely unaware that my entire world was being reconstructed around me. "How long have you been watching? How long have you known about me?" "All my life," she said softly. "Father would travel to London regularly on business, but his real purpose was often to catch glimpses of you. He attended your graduation from university, hiding in the back of the crowd. He was present at your investiture as Duke, again staying far enough away that he wouldn't be recognized. He has every newspaper clipping about your diplomatic successes, every mention of your charitable works." The emotion in her voice was unmistakable, and I turned back to face her. "And you? Have you been watching me as well?" She smiled then, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen on her face. "I saw you ride through Little Bramford 2 months ago when you were returning from London. You stopped to help a farmer whose cart had overturned, and you didn't just direct your servants to assist. You climbed down from your horse and put your own shoulder to the wheel. When I saw that, I knew everything Father had told me about your character was true." I returned to my chair, my mind racing with questions and implications. "The letter my mother wrote, it was addressed to your father?" "Yes." "They corresponded regularly over the years, always carefully, always discreetly. Your mother would send letters through various charitable organizations, and Father would respond through similar channels. They managed to see each other perhaps once or twice a year, always in public settings where their meetings could be explained as coincidental encounters between old family friends. The weight of their sacrifice, of the careful dance they had performed for decades to protect my legitimacy and my future, was overwhelming. Why didn't she tell me before she died? Why leave me to discover this through a letter 28 years later?" Cordelia's expression grew sad again. She tried, Your Grace. In her final weeks, she begged Father to come to her so that she could introduce you properly, so that you could know him before she passed. But he refused. He was terrified that seeing you, speaking with you as your father rather than a distant family friend, would break his resolve. He was afraid he might do something that would compromise your position or cause a scandal that would taint your mother's memory. I thought of those final days when my mother had seemed agitated about something, when she had repeatedly asked me to invite various old friends to visit. I had assumed she was simply trying to reconnect with people before her death, but now I understood she had been trying to arrange a way for me to meet my true father. He regrets it now, Cordelia continued. Every day, he regrets not taking that chance to speak with you, to let you know how proud he is of the man you've become. When I told him I was going to approach you at the ball, he was terrified but also hopeful that perhaps it wasn't too late to build some kind of relationship. The children had finished their lessons and were beginning to gather their slates and books. Several of them approached Cordelia to say goodbye, and I watched as she spoke with each child individually, asking about their families, encouraging their progress, making each one feel special and important. The genuine love in these interactions spoke volumes about her character, and I felt a surge of pride in claiming her as my sister. "What is he like?" I asked when the children had departed and we were alone. "Our father, what manner of man is he?" Her face brightened with obvious affection. "He is kind and principled, much like you, actually. He inherited a modest estate in Sussex and has devoted his life to improving the lives of his tenants and the surrounding community. He never pursued wealth or position, content to live simply as long as he could help others. He established several schools similar to this one and has quietly funded countless charitable efforts over the years. Does he look like me? Do I resemble him?" "Very much so," she said with a laugh. "You have his eyes, certainly, and his height. But more than that, you have his sense of justice, his inability to ignore suffering when he sees it. The way you help that farmer, the way you've expanded the charitable works at Westmont Manor, those are his qualities showing themselves in you." I felt a deep longing to meet this man who had given me life, who had loved my mother enough to sacrifice his own happiness for her reputation, who had watched me grow from a distance with pride and love. But I also felt the weight of the impossible situation we all faced. If the truth came out, I said slowly, it would destroy everything. The scandal would reach far beyond just our family. It would affect everyone connected to the Westmont name, all the people who depend on the estate, all the charitable works we support. Cordelia nodded solemnly. "Father understands that. He has never expected public recognition or acknowledgement. He would be content simply to meet you, to speak with you as your father for even a few moments. But he would never ask you to risk your position or your future for his sake." But as I looked at this remarkable woman who had revealed herself to be my sister, as I thought about the man who had apparently spent 30 years loving me from a distance, I realized that some things were more important than position and reputation. Some truths demanded to be acknowledged, regardless of the consequences. "I want to meet him," I said firmly. "I need to meet him. Not as the Duke of Westmont meeting a minor nobleman from Sussex, but as a son finally meeting his father." Tears filled Cordelia's eyes as she reached across and took my hand. "He will be so happy, Lysander. He has dreamed of this moment for so long, even though he was afraid to hope it might actually happen." As we sat there in that simple schoolhouse, holding hands like the siblings we had never known we were, I felt something shift inside my chest. The foundations of my identity had been shaken, but perhaps they were being rebuilt on something more solid, something more authentic than the careful lies that had shaped my understanding of myself. I had found not only the truth about my father, but a sister I never knew I had. And for the first time since reading that devastating letter, I began to feel hope that this revelation might lead not to destruction, but to a deeper understanding of who I was meant to be. The journey to Sussex took 2 days by horseback, and I had never felt more nervous about meeting anyone in my entire life. Cordelia rode beside me on a gentle mare, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about her childhood as we traveled through the countryside. The November weather had turned milder, with pale sunlight filtering through the bare branches of the trees that lined our path, and I took it as a good omen for the reunion that awaited us. Sir Edmund Harrington's estate was smaller than I had expected, but everything about it spoke of careful stewardship and genuine care for the land and its people. The manor house was built of warm golden stone, with ivy climbing its walls and smoke rising peacefully from several chimneys. Well-maintained cottages dotted the surrounding fields, their gardens still showing signs of the recent harvest, and I could see tenants working contentedly in the distance. As our horses approached the main drive, a man emerged from the stables, and my breath caught in my throat. Even from a distance, the resemblance was unmistakable. He was tall like me, with the same dark hair, though his was now streaked with silver, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that I recognized as similar to my own bearing. This was my father, the man whose blood ran in my veins, whose characteristics had shaped my personality in ways I was only beginning to understand. Sir Edmund had clearly been watching for our arrival, because he walked toward us with an expression of such hope and anxiety that it made my chest tighten with emotion. When we were close enough to see each other clearly, we both stopped, father and son meeting for the first time in nearly 3 decades, neither quite knowing how to bridge the enormous gap between what we had been to each other and what we might become. "Your Grace," he said formally, offering a proper bow, but his voice shook with barely contained emotion. "Father," I said simply, dismounting from my horse and walking toward him. The word seemed to break something inside him, and tears filled his eyes as he stepped forward and embraced me. I had been raised with the reserved affection typical of English nobility, but in that moment, all pretense fell away. This was my father holding me, the man who had loved me from a distance for my entire life, and I found myself clinging to him with an intensity that surprised us both. "My boy," he whispered against my shoulder. "My son, I never dared hope this day would come." When we finally separated, I could see that his eyes were indeed the same shade as mine, and his features bore a strong resemblance to what I saw in my mirror each morning. But beyond the physical similarities, I sensed something deeper, a connection that went beyond mere blood relationship to something more fundamental about the way we view the world. Cordelia had dismounted as well and was watching our reunion with obvious joy. "I told you he would come, Father. I told you he would want to know the truth." Sir Edmund wiped his eyes and smiled at her with such love and gratitude that I felt a pang of envy. They had shared a lifetime together, while I had grown up never knowing this remarkable man existed. But there was no resentment in my heart, only a deep sadness for all the lost years and a determination to make the most of whatever time we might have together. "Come inside," he said, gesturing toward the manor house. "We have so much to discuss, so much catching up to do. I want to hear everything about your life, your hopes, your dreams. I want to know the man you've become." The interior of the house reflected the same practical elegance as the exterior. The furniture was well made, but not ostentatious. The walls lined with books and paintings that spoke of intellectual interests rather than mere decoration. A fire crackled warmly in the main sitting room, and afternoon light streamed through windows that looked out over rolling fields where sheep grazed peacefully. As we settled into comfortable chairs, Sir Edmund began to tell me about his life, his work, and most importantly, his relationship with my mother. The story that emerged was one of a deep, abiding love that had sustained both of them through decades of separation and sacrifice. "I met Margaret at a literary salon in London when she was barely 18, he began, his eyes taking on a distant quality as he remembered. "She was already engaged to your adoptive father, but the wedding was still months away. We found ourselves talking about poetry and philosophy, and I was struck by her intelligence and her passion for justice. What began as intellectual conversation grew into something much deeper. He explained how they had tried to deny their feelings, how my mother had been determined to honor her engagement despite her growing love for him. She believed, as did I, that duty and honor required her to marry the Duke of Westmont as planned. Her family had arranged the match, and breaking it would have caused enormous scandal and financial hardship for everyone involved. But you continued to see each other, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "We did," he admitted, his voice heavy with both regret and remembered joy. "We told ourselves it was friendship, that we could maintain a proper relationship within the bounds of propriety. But love doesn't respect such careful boundaries. By the time she married, we both knew that our feelings had grown beyond anything that could be contained by social convention. The pain in his voice was evident as he described the early months of my mother's marriage, how she had tried desperately to be a good wife while struggling with her feelings for him. When she discovered she was carrying you, she was terrified. The timing made it impossible to deny whose child you were, but she was also determined to protect you from scandal. Did the Duke know? I asked, thinking of the man who had raised me with such love and patience. Sir Edmund nodded slowly. He suspected, certainly. He was not a foolish man, and the timing of your birth would have made it clear to anyone who thought about it carefully. But he chose to accept you as his heir, to love you as his own son, and to never publicly question your parentage. For that, I will be eternally grateful to him. The complexity of the situation struck me anew. 3 adults had conspired, each in their own way, to protect me from the consequences of circumstances beyond my control. The Duke of Westmont had raised another man's child as his heir, my mother had lived with the constant burden of her secret, and my true father had watched from a distance as I grew up calling another man father. Have you regretted it? I asked. The sacrifice you made, the life you gave up for my sake. Never, he said firmly. Not for a single moment. You were given opportunities and advantages that I could never have provided. You received the finest education, traveled the world, learned to navigate the highest levels of society. Most importantly, you were raised by a good man who taught you honor and responsibility. I may have given you life, but he gave you the tools to live it well. Cordelia had been quietly listening to our conversation, but now she spoke up. Tell him about the letters, Father. Tell him how you followed every aspect of his life. Sir Edmund smiled and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer, he withdrew a thick bundle of papers tied with ribbon. Every letter your mother ever sent me is here, he said, returning to his chair. She wrote to me about your first words, your first steps, your achievements at school. When you graduated from university, she sent me a copy of your thesis on agricultural reform. When you negotiated that trade agreement with France, she forwarded me the newspaper accounts of your success. He untied the ribbon and showed me page after page of my mother's elegant handwriting, chronicling my entire life from birth to adulthood. Through her letters, I felt as though I was part of your life, even though I could never acknowledge our relationship. I celebrated your triumphs and worried about your struggles just as any father would. The evidence of their devotion, of the careful way they had maintained their connection while protecting my future, was overwhelming. These 2 people had loved me enough to sacrifice their own happiness, to live with the constant pain of separation, to ensure that I would have every advantage in life. But as I sat there in my father's modest sitting room, surrounded by evidence of a lifetime of love and sacrifice, I realized that the advantages they had given me came with responsibilities. I had been blessed with position and influence not just for my own benefit, but so that I could use those gifts to help others, just as both my parents had done in their different ways. There's something I need to tell you both, I said, my voice steady with newfound resolve. I've fallen in love with Cordelia. The silence that followed was profound. Sir Edmund's face went through a range of expressions, from shock to concern to something that might have been understanding. Cordelia's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away from my gaze. Lysander, she said softly, we're siblings. It wouldn't be proper, it wouldn't be right. Half-siblings, I corrected, who grew up not knowing each other existed. What I feel for you isn't the love of a brother for his sister. It's the love of a man for a remarkable woman who shares his values, his passion for helping others, his determination to make the world better. Sir Edmund leaned forward in his chair, studying both of our faces carefully. Are you certain of your feelings, son? This isn't simply gratitude or the excitement of discovering a new family connection. I'm certain, I said firmly. I was drawn to her from the moment I met her in the chapel, before I knew who she was. Her intelligence, her compassion, her dedication to helping those children in Little Bramford, these are the qualities that capture my heart. Learning that she's my sister only added to my respect for her. It didn't create my love. Cordelia was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And what of your position, your responsibilities as Duke. What the scandal that would result if people learned the truth about your parentage and our relationship. Some things are more important than avoiding scandal, I said, reaching across to take her hand. Some truths are worth the risk. I've spent my entire life living according to other people's expectations, maintaining appearances, playing the role I was assigned. But meeting you, learning about our father, discovering the truth about who I really am, has shown me that authenticity matters more than reputation. I turned to Sir Edmund, my voice filled with conviction. I want to publicly acknowledge you as my father. I want to marry Cordelia with the full knowledge of our family connection. And I want to use whatever influence my position provides to support the kind of charitable work you've both dedicated your lives to, regardless of what society might think. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of sheep bleating in the fields. Father and daughter looked at each other, communicating in the wordless way that people who have shared a lifetime together can manage. Finally, Sir Edmund spoke. The choice is yours to make, Lysander. You're a grown man with the wisdom to understand the consequences of your decisions. If this is truly what you want, if you're prepared to face whatever challenges might come, then you have my blessing. Cordelia squeezed my hand, tears glistening in her eyes. Are you truly prepared to risk everything for love? Your title, your inheritance, your place in society. I'm prepared to risk everything for truth, I replied. For the chance to live authentically, to honor the sacrifices you and our father made, and to build something real and lasting with the woman I love. As the sun set over the peaceful Sussex countryside, I felt a sense of completion that I had never experienced before. I had found my true father, discovered a sister who shared my deepest values, and chosen love over convention. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be honest, and that made all the difference in the world.